Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Rosie Falcone. I'm the Homeless Programs Manager, and today I'm joined by Timur Chattery, our Homeless Program Specialist. I first want to extend our congratulations on your 2024 ESG Annual Award, and to also thank you for your continual hard work and dedication. Our success would not be possible without your outstanding efforts. A few housekeeping items for today's webinar. Please enter all questions into the questions panel of the GoToWebinar. We will be addressing questions at the end of our presentation. If you have remaining questions or questions we can't get to before the end of the webinar, or for any agency-specific questions, please email those to our program inbox at homelessprograms@tdhca.texas.gov. Please note that this inbox has now changed. We are no longer using the ESG@TDHCA inbox. Now all homeless programs in correspondence goes to our new inbox. During today's webinar, we will go over TDHCA programs, ESG funding distribution, and available resources for households. The main focus for today is to familiarize you with the requirements that apply to the administration of an ESG program. We will highlight some of the fiscal and administrative requirements that are applicable to most of your organizations, like cost allocation, procurement, and reporting requirements, as well as providing you links to additional resources as we move along. With that, ready to get started.
Thank you, Rosie. First, we will go over a high-level overview of TDHCA, briefly go over some of our programs, and differentiate between the SFHP division and the compliance division. So TDHCA has a number of different program types. Our poverty and homelessness prevention programs include the Single Family and Homeless Programs Division, which houses the ESG, HHSP, and the Ending Homelessness Fund. Other TDHCA programs include rental assistance, rental housing development, energy efficiency, home repair, single-family home ownership, and home buyer assistance. ESG providers may find it helpful to connect with other providers, such as rental assistance providers or rental housing that were developed with help from TDHCA. You can learn more about other providers by accessing TDHCA's Help for Texans page, which is linked on this slide. This tool is accessed by both community members looking for assistance and by our Housing Resource Center staff when folks contact TDHCA. Each provider has their own page that includes their location, contact information, and the TDHCA funded services that they provide. Subrecipients can also use Help for Texans to see what organizations in your area may have TDHCA funding if you need to make a referral. You can find all ESG funded subrecipients under the Homeless Services section, and if you notice any updates that need to be made, please send them to our general inbox, which, as Rosie said, is homelessprograms@tdhca.texas.gov. So now an overview of the divisions. As ESG subrecipients, you'll be primarily working with two of the department's divisions. That's the Single Family and Homelessness Programs Division and the Compliance Division. Members of the Single Family and Homelessness Programs are responsible for contracting and performance. While you may hear from our director, Abigail Versip, or our Homeless Programs Manager, Rosie Falcone, most of the communication regarding your performance will be handled primarily by me, Timur. If you're unsure of who to contact, you may again contact our general inbox, and your request can be routed to the correct person. On the other hand, members of the Compliance Division are responsible for compliance with rules and regulations and are led by Ernest Hunt, our Director of Compliance, and Manuel Peña, Manager of Physical Inspections. A listing of the compliance staff can be found by accessing the link noted on the slide. Next, we'll delve a bit further into the roles of each division. So on this slide, you'll see a general overview of the division of duties between the Single Family and Homelessness Programs Division and the Compliance Division. Generally, the SFHP division takes the applications, sets up contracts, reviews reporting, and provides technical assistance, while the compliance staff follows up on how well the contract and any applicable regulations are being followed. Compliance staff can also answer questions from subrecipient staff during monitoring visits. So the Emergency Solutions Grants Program is a competitive grant that awards funds to private nonprofit organizations, cities, and/or counties in the state of Texas to provide the services necessary to help persons that are at risk of homelessness or homeless quickly regain stability in permanent housing. The 2024 ESG annual allocation is about $9.29 million. Despite its relatively small size, ESG supports one of our most important areas, assisting persons who are homeless or are facing homelessness. Each continuum of care, or COC, receives an allocation amount based on a formula that takes into account a multitude of factors such as population, PIC counts, etc. The ESG program provides funding to engage homeless individuals and families living on the street, improve the number and quality of emergency shelters for homeless individuals and families, to help operate emergency shelters, provide essential services to shelter residents, rapidly rehouse homeless individuals and households, and prevent families and individuals from becoming homeless. These eligible activities fall under 6 components that subrecipients can be funded for, and you'll see them on this slide. There are street outreach, emergency shelter, homelessness prevention, HMIS, and administration. You can learn more about these components in Title 24 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 576, as well as Title 10, Chapter 7.32 of the Texas Administrative Code.
Thank you, Timur. Let's dive into the federal and state requirements that govern the administration of an ESG program. As ESG subrecipients, you're required to follow 2 CFR 200, the Texas Administrative Code, your ESG contract, and for those of you that are units of local government, also Texans. In addition, there are some portions of 24 CFR Part 576 that you must be familiar with as they affect allowability of costs. We've included those sections here. Links to the full versions of these regulations can be found on our ESG program guidance page, also linked at the bottom of this slide. For those of you managing an ESG program, responsible for approving and processing payments, and/or members of the fiscal department, the administrative and financial requirements noted on this slide are of extreme importance. The regulations in Part 200 of the Code of Federal Regulations include the requirements for financial policies and procedures, allowability of cost, cost allocation, procurement, selected items of cost, and single audit requirements. Today, we will focus on single audit, cost allocation, procurement, and match requirements. Chapter 1 of the Texas Administrative Code, or TAC, sets forth the guidelines for those receiving federal and state funds, and Chapter 2 of the TAC sets forth guidelines for enforcement of non-compliance with contracts administered by the department. Lastly, the subrecipient's ESG contract is another source for complying with federal and state financial requirements. So let's begin by reviewing single audit requirements. Although the homeless programs team does not handle single audit compliance, it is important to us that you're aware of these deadlines as it has a direct impact on your ability to access ESG funds. At the time our program specialist reviews your draws, they must verify your organization is not delinquent with any submission. If a delinquency exists, they will be unable to process your payment until that is resolved. The single audit is an organization-wide audit of an entity expending $750,000 or more in federal or state funds for those organizations which have a fiscal year beginning before October 1st of 2024. For those organizations with a fiscal year starting on or after October 1st of 2024, the single audit threshold has been raised to $1 million or more in expenditures. An organization may have both a federal and a state single audit required. However, it is most likely that your organizations will only need a federal single audit. The deadline for completion is dependent on each entity's fiscal year end date and not individual grant years. It is due the earlier of 30 days after receipt of the auditor's report, or 9 months after the end of its respective fiscal year. This deadline is the same for both federal and state single audits. The submission process for a single audit depends on the type of audit. Federal single audits must be submitted to the Federal Audit Clearinghouse, or FAC. A notice of the submission must be sent within 5 business days to the single audit email noted on the slide. To expedite the processing, it is recommended, though not required, to send a PDF copy of the single audit and a copy of the FAC acceptance email along with your notice. This is important because we will not be able to process your draw request, enter into a new contract, and possibly approve an amendment until compliance has updated your submission date. For a state single audit, you must submit a PDF copy of your single audit to the single audit email in order to be in compliance. Please note that an overdue audit may result in a delay of setting up your contract. The Audit Certification Form, or ACF, is a department requirement that is used as a certification of expenditures for each fiscal year, and it is due within 2 months after each fiscal year end date. It will be submitted to the single audit email inbox as well, and you can access the ACF by going to the Compliance Forms webpage, which we've linked on our slide, and ensure you enable macros in order for the form to properly work. If you have any questions or need help completing the form, please reach out to the Compliance Division by emailing them at the single audit email. We'll now move to the cost principles section of the CFR, specifically basic considerations of cost. So what makes a cost allowable? Generally, for costs to be allowable, it must be reasonable and necessary, meet the limitations of the grant, be consistent with policies and procedures. It must be afforded consistent treatment throughout, must be determined in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles, and it must not be included as a cost-sharing requirement for any other grant. It must also be adequately documented. In other words, the expense must be needed to conduct required program activities. It cannot exceed any funding maximums established by the grant. It must not be for something that is not explicitly allowable under program regulations. And the expenditure type or category must be part of the regular procedures and treated the same across funding within the organization for that same type of expense. All of this must be easily identifiable and supported through your documentation. Now that we know what makes a cost allowable, we must categorize it. All costs can be categorized as direct or indirect. A direct cost is a cost that can specifically be tied to performing activities in the ESG program. Typically, those expenses are salaries and wages for a case manager or equipment used solely for the ESG program. Indirect costs are costs which benefit more than one program, like rent or utility costs. Due to the diverse characteristic and accounting practices of nonprofit organizations, it is not possible to specify the types of costs that may be classified as indirect in all situations. One thing to remember, however, is that a cost may not be allocated as an indirect cost in one program if any similar costs have been assigned as a direct cost either in that specific program or within any program in the organization. Now that we have covered what makes a cost allowable and how to determine the type of cost, it's time to determine how to allocate these costs. Essential to spending federal funds correctly is understanding what cost allocation is. Cost allocation is the process of dividing shared costs between programs based on the benefit each program receives. The goal is to ensure that federal funds are used solely for the programs they're intended for. As such, cost allocation is charging an expenditure in part or as a whole to a project, or what we would call an activity type or a fund, all expenditures must be allocated 100%, either in one program or across multiple programs. Each cost incurred for the same purpose must be treated consistently in similar circumstances. That is, it must be either a direct cost consistently or an indirect cost consistently. Finally, these guidelines must be followed for all federal expenses, not only ESG expenditures. Once a cost has been determined to be allowable, it must be allocable to federal awards consistent with 2 CFR 200, Section 405. That is, it must be a cost that is allowed under a particular program's implementing regulations. So that's 24 CFR Part 576 for our ESG program. Finally, the cost must also be an eligible cost in the grant award and agreement under which a subrecipient operates. For example, costs associated with construction or rehab would not be allocable as those costs are prohibited by state regulations. It is important to note that a cost may not be charged to a federal award with the purpose of overcoming shortages or avoiding restrictions imposed by federal statutes, regulations, or terms and conditions of a federal award. Now that we've covered what the process of cost allocation and allocability of a cost is, we move to determining how each cost will be charged to federal grants. A cost allocation plan is the organization's documented method of allocating costs to its programs and supporting services to the extent each program or service bears its fair share in accordance with relative benefits received. Your cost allocation plans must also follow agency policies and generally accepted accounting principles. It will detail the methodology and base that will be used for each type of cost. For example, the methodology for charging rent to each program may be based on the percentage of the total square footage occupied by each program, less common spaces. There are two ways to allocate indirect costs: through an indirect cost rate or through direct allocation. If your agency is eligible to use the de minimis rate, then this rate has to be entered into your ESG contract in order to charge the flat rate for all shared expenses. The rate was recently updated to 15% for awards issued after October 1st of 2024. If your organization has a federally approved indirect cost rate, this too has to be added to your ESG contract prior to charging indirect costs based on the rate, and we will need a copy of the approval from your federal cognizant agency. Neither of these rates exempt your contracts from federal maximums established by the ESG regulations. So for us, for example, it would be your cap of 3% maximum admin expenses. Another option is to charge indirect cost using a direct allocation method that is documented by your cost allocation plan. Okay, so now it's time to talk about actual purchases. So for every expense funded with federal funds, a proper procurement process must be followed. Procurement requirements are lengthy and must be followed fully in order to have an allowable purchase. We have highlighted a few of the requirements that are more likely to create a risk if not followed. Before a subrecipient can perform a purchase, it must have policies and procedures which comply with state and federal regulations. For subrecipients that must follow both the CFR and TXIMs, the more stringent requirements will apply. Your policies, as well as each procurement effort, must be structured in a way that ensures full and open competition. For example, if procuring for tablets, your procurement specifications cannot note you're looking for iPads. This would be restricting competition as you're utilizing a brand name as a specification. In order to avoid the purchase of unnecessary items, a cost or price analysis that provides for a review of the procurements must be performed. This also ensures your purchase is the most economical. Lastly, all procurement records must be sufficient to document the history of each procurement. At minimum, it must include the rationale. Your documentation at a minimum must include the rationale for the procurement method, the contract type selection, contractor selection or rejection, and the basis for the contract price. There are three types of procurement methods: informal procurement, formal procurement, and non-competitive procurement methods. Informal procurement methods include micro purchases and simplified acquisitions, or what we used to refer to as small purchase. For micro purchases, a subrecipient does not have to obtain quotes for a purchase that does not exceed the threshold of $10,000 for procurement transactions that are not subject to Texans. For those subject to Texans, the threshold maximum is $3,000. And as a reminder, any unit of local government must follow Texans. Nonprofits of managing ESG grants only follow the CFR. Although quotes are not required, the subrecipient must maintain documentation that shows the price was paid was reasonable based on research, experience, purchase history, or other supporting information. The second type is simplified acquisitions. This is for transactions that are higher than the applicable micro purchase threshold, so that's either the $3,000 or the $10,000, but less than $250,000. Price quotations must be obtained from a reasonable number of qualified sources. Typically, we see a minimum of 3 quotes for this. There are 2 types of formal procurement methods. This is required for purchases that exceed $250,000. These types of procurement require public notice and are competitive. The first type is sealed bids. An award based on sealed bid procurement is made to the responsible bidder, which conforms to the specifications of the invitation and whose price is the lowest. It must end with a fixed price contract, and you must receive at least 2 bids for this to be a viable competitive procurement. This is most commonly used for procuring construction services. The main goal of a sealed bid is to contract out with the most cost-effective bidder. Proposals are used when price is not the best factor to determine a qualified bidder. Contracts arising from this procurement are made to the responsible respondent whose proposal is most advantageous to the subrecipient. It takes into account other factors and not only price. Typically, this type of procurement is used for professional services like your single auditor, legal services, consultants, where qualifications are a higher priority. Lastly, there is a non-competitive procurement. This is only viable if the aggregate amount of the procurement transaction does not exceed the applicable micro purchase threshold. It is only available from one source. There's a public emergency. Subrecipient received prior written approval from TDHCA, or after soliciting several qualified sources, a response was found to be inadequate. Those are the circumstances where a sole source or non-competitive procurement would be allowable, and this type of procurement is rarely used. For more information, please visit our procurement webinar. Before we move on to match, can Is anybody having trouble hearing me? I just saw on the questions somebody's having trouble hearing me. Okay, thank you. Okay, so now we move on to your match requirements and reporting. All ESG contracts have a minimum match requirement of 100%. However, if your organization committed to a 110% match during the funding competition, that percentage becomes your required minimum. While you're allowed to report match contributions exceeding 110%, doing so offers no additional advantage during competition. Additionally, once funds are reported as a match for ESG, they cannot be used as a match for any other grants. Eligible activities used to meet this requirement must align with ESG program rules, meaning they need to be allowable under ESG regulations, and all relevant record keeping must be maintained in accordance with records retention for ESG. Match must be reported when the eligible expenses incurred. The reporting is done through our housing contract system. Frequency of reporting will vary depending on the type of match being reported. Typically, we would expect reporting on a monthly basis when using sources like grants that pay salaries or office space expenses. Tomorrow we'll cover reporting more thoroughly later in the webinar. So what if you have match expenses, but you have not reported them when incurred? We understand that there may be times when a subrecipient must report match expenditures that span multiple reporting months. If this is the case, you should report all previous months' match in the next immediate draw submission. Your internal financial documents should indicate the correct month or months in which the match was incurred, and records must easily reconcile to the cumulative match reported in HCS. You do not need to submit this documentation with your draw. You do need to keep it with your financial records at your organization. So now that we have an overview of match regulations, we'll go over a few of the match source types. There are various sources of match that can be used, such as federal and state funds, cash contributions, non-cash sources like volunteer time, donated goods, value of donated buildings, and program income. A few requirements to keep in mind: in order to use federal, state, or private donations, you must ensure that their respective regulations allow the use of their funds as match for other federal programs, and that private donations are not restricted in use. So for example, we have CSBG funds up there. They're another federal source. CSBG regulations allow for those funds to be used as match for the ESG program. However, any other federal source, that funding would not be available for match. And so that's what you need to have in your records if you are using other federal sources, something that specifically says their funds could be used for match. You must also ensure that the activities that you are reporting as match are eligible under both ESG regulations and the regulations from the federal or state program you're using as match. For non-cash sources like volunteer time, the activity the volunteer is performing must be eligible under ESG regulations in order for it to be eligible as match. For example, if a volunteer is delivering meals, then this time would not be eligible to use as match, as you would not be able to pay someone to deliver meals using ESG funds. So now, how do you support your match reporting? At a minimum, Supporting documentation must indicate the source of funds being used for match. Documentation that shows funds can be used as match. There must be a value or a cost defined for the activity being performed as match. For example, an in-kind donation, such as office supplies, is donated to a shelter. The value of the contribution would be documented with a fair market value of the items donated. A quick web search of how much that would have cost you if you were to buy it. That is how you could determine the fair market value of the supplies or supply provided. Lastly, the documentation should have a clear description of what the item or items are or what the activity being performed is. For example, if volunteers donate their time to perform outreach, timesheets could be valid as support documentation. The value of the time should be calculated based on an appropriate hourly rate for the type of work performed. This would be an hourly rate similar to what you pay your outreach workers. If you don't employ any, the rate would be what others in your service area pay their outreach workers. The timesheet must clearly indicate the activity they were performing. This supports eligibility. Total number of hours per day and hourly rate. This supports the value reported. And clearly indicate that these were volunteers and not salaries paid by another grant. The reason that distinction is important is because if you're using another grant as match and the activity is time spent, those requirements for salary and wages are a bit more stringent. For additional information on match, please refer to the match webinar linked below. Next, Timur will go over some of the administrative processes that are pertinent to ESG administration.
Thank you, Rosie. So first, I want to do a brief overview of the process for contract amendments. For all budget amendment requests, a budget amendment form is needed, and that's linked on this slide. For any requests for contract extensions, an email with the requested extension length and the reason for the extension is required. Contracts can be extended for up to 6 months by the program director. Any extension requests that are in excess of 6 months can be granted with board approval. However, board approval will require justification for the request and any additional information and data regarding the request. As a reminder, all amendments must be submitted at least 30 days prior to the contract end date. For most of y'all that have a contract end date of October 31st, 2025, that deadline is the 1st of October, 2025. And lastly, I want to remind y'all that funds cannot be moved between components, so between homelessness prevention, rapid rehousing, but can only be moved within a line item, such as moving funds between rapid rehousing financial and rapid rehousing TBRA, or you can move funds between HMIS and the administrative line items and the program components, as long as the 12% cap for HMIS and the 3% cap for admin are still met. For all additional information on the regulations about contract amendments, please take a look at the TAC reference at the top of this slide. So next, I want to go over the direct deposit and the TIN forms. On this screen, you'll see examples and templates of these forms. These forms have already been submitted by everyone as they're due during the application cycle. However, we do want to note that if any information on these forms change, please reach out to us. If changes are made during the term of the contract, TDHCA staff will call and verify the change with subrecipients. So please, if anything happens with these forms, if any changes, just reach out to us and in order to avoid delays of draw requests. So now I want to go over housing contract system access. So the grant, contract contact, and contract executor will have access to HCS, and other subrecipient staff members may also be granted HCS access for reporting purposes. The executor is contacted when there is a contract level event, such as a reallocation of funds or a contract amendment. The contract contact, however, has a much more active role in communicating with TDHCA staff. Each grant can only have one, so please ensure that there's an individual who is responsive to any emails that TDHCA staff may send and can delegate work to the correct staff members should assistance be needed in reporting other matters related to the contract. Please note that even though the contract executive can be designated as the contact, these are two truly separate roles, and it is highly recommended that they are performed by different staff members to prevent any delays. If a subrecipient decides to keep the executor and contact the same, we highly encourage them to forward any correspondence to a responsible staff member as well. Finally, designating the contract contact as well as granting access to additional staff is done by filling out the HCS access request form on our website. It's also linked on here, and it's and emailing the completed form, including the executive signature, to our homeless programs inbox. Please note, remember that whenever any information on that form changes, we do require an updated form. So next in this section, we will take a look at the housing contract system, some guidelines on monthly reporting, as well as SAGE reporting. So the housing contract system is divided into two levels, the contract level and the activity level. The contract level has documents pertinent to the administration of the contract, such as the executed contract, any amendments that have come through, the organization's written standards, HCS access request form, the direct deposit authorization form, etc. The activity level includes all monthly reporting, which includes the monthly performance report, monthly expenditure report, and all draw requests. So with the acceptance of ESG funds, you agree to enter data into HMIS or a comparable database for those operating as domestic violence or legal service providers. This data is then used to assist providers with filling out monthly reporting to TDHCA. Subrecipients are also required to submit monthly draws that consist of the monthly performance report and the monthly expenditure report. These draws will be submitted through the housing contract system no later than the last day of each month and reflects any performance and expenditures conducted in the prior month. We will be going over performance reporting tomorrow in session 2, but on the next slide, I will go over what to expect with the monthly expenditure report. So on this slide, you'll see an abbreviated version of the MER, the monthly expenditure report. You'll frequently see us abbreviating as that. For every item number, you'll see the category, the amount that was initially funded, which is referred to as the budgeted amount, how much has already been drawn, and the available balance. The total monthly expenditures and the non-program fund credit are the only two columns that can be filled out by subrecipients. The non-program fund credit column is where you'd report the amount of match that was incurred for each individual line item. And the total monthly expenditures is where you'd report all expenditures for that line item, inclusive of any match. Lastly, once the total monthly expenditures and non-program fund credit, if applicable, column have been completed, this draw amount column, which is on the far right, will populate with how much you're all requesting to draw. So moving on to the table, the non-program table. This is where you'd report the source of match, whether it comes from private donations, other state grants, or other federal grants. As a reminder, the sum of this column, the sum of this table, must equal the sum of the non-program fund credit column. It is important to note that the expenditures reported in the MER must have corresponding performance in the performance report. And the performance report must be submitted prior to being able to fully submit the draw request. We will be going over the monthly performance report tomorrow, but for additional information on either or just to have a refresher, you can see our monthly reporting guide linked on this slide. Next, we'll talk about HMIS. So as I said before, all subrecipients are required to enter their data into HMIS or a comparable database if you're a domestic service provider, the domestic violence client provider. Any new providers in a given COC unfamiliar with HMIS should contact their respective HMIS lead for information and assistance in getting set up. And you'll be able to see them here. These are we reached out to the HMIS leads and they provided these as go-to emails to contact. So in addition to monthly reporting, subrecipients must also submit information requested by the department for our annual reporting. The annual reporting may extend over multiple contracts. It's for the program year. ESG subrecipients will submit information yearly as required for the consolidated annual performance and evaluation report, and we'll abbreviate it as the CAPER, which includes SAGE reporting using HMIS exports. So SAGE reporting is required annually for ESG annual contracts, and I will be reaching out to the contract contacts as well as the executors, typically around the beginning of September, with details and upload links, and if you have any questions at that point, just to reach out to me. So on this slide, we'll see some additional resources. There are several useful resources for when you are collecting and reporting data. At the federal level, HUD has issued guidance on HMIS and data in their HMIS data standards, and then the ESG program HMIS manual. Resources from the department can be found in the ESG guidance webpage, which was linked earlier, and the monthly reporting guide and sample monthly report as well. Just to rehash that, the ESG monthly reporting guide goes over HCS access, report submission, and specifics of what is needed in the reports, including what exactly is to be reported for each of the data fields in the MPR.
Thank you, Timur. Before we end, I want to remind you that part 2 of the implementation webinar will be tomorrow at 10 a.m. The information that will be covered during part 2 is going to be specific to ESG program eligibility, client file documentation, and agency-wide required documentation. It will cover reporting requirements, but that section will focus on performance reporting and not the monthly expenditure reports that we went over today. Okay, and with that, we thank you all for your participation in today's webinar and for all of the work that you do to help the most vulnerable. This does wrap up our first session of the ESG implementation webinar. If anyone has any questions, we can take them now, or as always, you can email any questions to our program email. As a reminder, we have updated our general inbox, so questions can be sent to homelessprograms@tdhca.texas.gov. But we will be here for the next 20 minutes or so, depending on how many questions we get, to answer anything that might have come up today. And then we did have a question earlier on. This webinar will be posted to our TDHCA video library probably early next week. That way we post both sections. We will send a listserv once the website has been updated. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions, but we will wait about 5 more minutes in case anything comes in. Okay, I think we have one. We've unmuted you, Ms. Gavion.
Hi, Rosie. Good morning. I just had a quick question. I believe it was either you or Tamora that basically said if we're documenting in HMIS and Apricot, do y'all prefer just HMIS, or are we okay with just documenting in the one database? Does that make sense?
Yes, so HMIS, you are required to report in HMIS. There is not an option unless you meet the definition of a domestic violence provider, then you do have the ability to use a comparable database. But other than that, everybody has to report in HMIS. The SAGE reporting comes strictly from HMIS. The benefit of having a different tracking system as well is there are a few variances between what you have to report in the housing contract system for the state that is not necessarily also the same in HMIS. So it's not difficult to obtain that information with help from your HMIS lead, but HMIS has to be your main source of record.
Got it. And it's a two-parter. Are y'all also okay with the virtual file in HMIS, or should we still maintain, we also with ESG have a hard copy file that we keep? Should we continue that practice, or should we just maintain virtually?
You can maintain virtually. The only thing is that you have to have support documentation for proof of homelessness or at risk of homelessness in addition to income. So as long as those can get attached and be part of your virtual file, you don't have to have both.
Got it. Thank you so much for answering that. That was very helpful.
No problem. And we will go over a more in-depth client file documentation in tomorrow's webinar. So we do have that section covered in there as well. Now we did have a question come in about match. Are CDBG, so Community Development Block Grant, allowable as match? I do not know that. So the regulation itself or that program would have to have something either saying you're not able to use these funds as match, or you can contact your funding source directly for that grant, and they will be able to answer that question for you. Unfortunately, we don't know about other grants. The reason that we used CSBG as an example is because we are the pass-through entity for CSBG federal funds, so we have that record, and that's how we know that fund can be used for ESG match. And CSBG is the Community Services Block Grant. Okay, well, we will be here until 12 o'clock, so 6 more minutes to see if anything else comes in. If not, we do thank you for your time and for joining us today. We hope to see some of you tomorrow.
I see a
We
question.
did have another one come in. Go ahead, Timur, sorry.
Yeah, I see a message from Tanya about the MER. So the MER, the monthly expenditure report, is on the housing contract system. So once your contract is fully executed, we will send out the username and password for any new folks who requested access to the HCS, to the housing contract system. And I will also send out a few resources when that happens as well. Of course.
And just to let everyone know, I know Timur has been reaching out and contracts are back in DocuSign. We did have to pull some 2024 contracts because of the CFR change that occurred on October 1st of 2024. We had some updated language that we had to put in there for single audit, along with a few other things. But you should be receiving, if you have not already, your contracts are all in DocuSign now, and you should be receiving them for your first signature starting today throughout tomorrow.
See a question from Jamie. The contract start date is the 1st of November of this year. It's for 12 months and ends on the 31st of October of next year.